Did the intellectuals of the 1950s really understand Elvis and his impact on American culture? Were college professors of the time too quick to dismiss rock and roll and its influence? How did Elvis's controversial image and performances challenge the social and cultural norms of the 1950s? In the 1950s, college professors were not immune to sharing their opinions on the controversial figure that was Elvis Presley. While most academic discussions of the time did not include the king of rock and roll, there were a few notable exceptions. One such exception was Professor Wood from Arizona State College, head of the art department, who compared Elvis to famous statues of Hermes and Theseus. According to the Boston Post, Wood claimed that Elvis and these ancient statues shared striking similarities in their facial features. The professor's observations about Presley's bumps and grinds on stage is sure to have sparked interest and speculation among readers. It's clear that even in the 50s, Elvis was a cultural phenomenon that could not be ignored, even by the academic elite. The comparison of a rock and roll icon to timeless works of art surely raised eyebrows and encouraged debate among the scholarly community. This glimpse into the perspective of a college professor adds an intriguing layer to the ongoing conversation about Elvis and his impact on popular culture. While some may have dismissed Elvis and rock and roll as trivial, others, like Professor Wood, found deeper connections and associations worth exploring. The clash of classical art and modern music, as seen through the eyes of academia, paints a compelling picture of the era's cultural tensions. Professor Jones, from the University of Texas, stands firm in his belief that rock and roll music itself is not to blame for any perceived immorality. According to Variety, in an interview given in Austin, Texas, on April 30, 1957, he explained that the objectionable aspects of rock and roll come from the people associated with it and the atmosphere they create. Jones adamantly insists that no type of music can be labeled as immoral in itself, firmly placing the blame on the actions of the individuals involved. He expressed his personal distaste for rock and roll performances that lack good taste, specifically calling out Elvis Presley as an example. Jones seems to hold the view that it is not the music itself that is objectionable, but rather the way it is performed and the type of people it attracts. In his interview, he defended the music form while acknowledging that certain performances and individuals within the rock and roll scene may be problematic. His stance on the matter sheds light on the complexity of the debate surrounding rock and roll and its perceived moral implications. The professor undoubtedly brings an interesting perspective to the ongoing conversation about the influence of rock and roll music on society. His views challenge the widely held assumptions about the nature of rock and roll music and the moral judgments placed upon it. Ultimately, his comments prompt further reflection on the nuanced issues at the heart of the rock and roll debate. Dr. Jones confidently proclaimed that rock and roll was just a passing fad and would soon be a distant memory. Professor Webster's address on Elvis Presley and Shakespeare was featured in an article in Variety, where he boldly dissected the appeal of Presley's music to the youth. He described Presley's music as a rhythm of self-pity and ugliness, contrasting it with the vitality and exuberance of jazz from the 1920s. Dr. Webster warned of the dangers of rock and roll, claiming that it emphasized exhaustion, self-torture, and frustration among the youth. Professor Clark, in his column for the Toronto Daily Star, dismissed Elvis Presley's show as a phony spectacle intended to manipulate the audience's reactions. He observed that the build-up on stage was clearly orchestrated to elicit a specific response from the audience, making the entire show seem orchestrated and inauthentic. Professor Clark noted that the noisy atmosphere of the show was simply part of the act, and he seemed unimpressed by the whole production. Dr. Jones, on the other hand, expressed doubt that rock and roll would have any lasting significance and dismissed it as another passing trend in popular culture. Professor Webster, in his article for Variety, linked the popularity of Elvis Presley to the self-pity and hatred that ran through the music, urging closer examination of the societal forces at play. Despite the differing viewpoints, all three scholars seem to share a sense of skepticism towards the impact and influence of rock and roll in Elvis Presley's music. Dr. Ray L. Birdwhistle, an anthropology professor from University of Buffalo, had some interesting insights on the impact of Elvis Presley's show in Toronto. According to Birdwhistle, Elvis's performance stirred up a lot of emotions among his audience, particularly with his famous pelvic contortions. Birdwhistle suggested that Elvis's show was not just entertaining, but also had a profound effect on the moral and psychological welfare of the youth who attended. Contrary to the views of other experts, Birdwhistle believed that Elvis's show did have an appeal to the baser passions and could potentially have a negative influence on the youth. He pointed out that the sudden rise in birth rate following World War II had created a generation of fans who flocked to see Elvis perform, adding a socio-economic dimension to the hysteria. Birdwhistle also acknowledged the similarities between Elvis's performance techniques and those of high-powered evangelists, linking the hysteria to the manipulation of emotions. He highlighted the failure of society to impose responsibilities of adulthood on young people, suggesting that it contributed to the overwhelming response to Elvis's show. Despite his concerns, Birdwhistle did recognize the undeniable impact Elvis had in creating a cultural phenomenon that could not be ignored. He challenged the notion that Elvis's show was harmless, arguing that it was important to consider the potential negative effects on the impressionable young audience. Overall, Birdwhistle's analysis offered a thought-provoking perspective on the complexities of Elvis Presley's influence and the societal implications of his performances. Dr. Birdwhistle, an expert in kinesics, studied Elvis Presley and found him to be a fascinating subject of anthropological speculations. After watching Elvis perform in Buffalo in 1957, the professor found his findings still inconclusive. He described Elvis's gyrations as not sexy, but only a caricature of sex, and insisted it was nothing to raise concern among psychologists or parents. Dr. Birdwhistle stated that Presley joined his audience in making fun of adult emotions with his appearance and gestures. He explained that the singer's movements were overstatements of the young adolescent's mocking attitude against the adult. According to the professor, Elvis was an amazingly skilled entertainer and a high response rate to the audience reactions. He contended that there was never a performer versus spectator situation. It seems, then, that even the intellectual crowd in the 50s was at odds with itself when it came to Elvis Presley. The eggheads might have been better able to express their opinions about Elvis and the changes he was helping make in American culture. Still, they could come to no consensus in their judgment concerning his capacity for spreading good or evil across the cultural landscape. Who described Elvis's hip movements as not sexy but only a caricature of sex? Dr. Birdwhistle. Which professor stated that Elvis's audience was a product of the sudden rise in the birth rate following World War II. Dr. Clark. Who described Elvis's music as emphasizing exhaustion, self-torture, frustration, and always a rhythm of sullen, ugly complaint. Dr. Webster. Which professor declared that Elvis and Greek statues had the same nose, lips, and sideburns? Professor Wood. Who stated that rock and roll was just another part of the cycle of fatism in the last 30 years? Professor Jones. Who was dismissive of Elvis's show as a phony, but also believed it was harmless? Dr. Clark. Which professor admitted to have never seen Elvis in action but still supported him? Professor McLuhan. Who declared that Elvis's show was intended to secure a certain kind of audience reaction and was a noisy show? Dr. Clark. Which professor described Elvis's audience as a tough generation of youngsters who can more than take Elvis Presley in their stride? Dr. Clark. Who described Elvis as an amazingly skilled entertainer, an excellent showman with a high response rate to the audience reactions? Dr. Webster.